There's something happening right now in the Middle East that most people are completely missing. Not because the news isn't covering it, but because they're showing you the explosions without explaining the chess game happening behind them. Missiles are flying, bases are being hit, and yes, the headlines are dramatic. But here's the real question nobody is asking loudly enough. How is Iran doing this? How is a country with a struggling economy, crippling international sanctions, and no advanced satellite network of its own striking with this level of precision? How does Iran know exactly where US warships are positioned? How does it know the radar locations? How did it hit a building connected to CIA operations so cleanly that it sent shockwaves through the intelligence community? Because here's the thing about intelligence agencies. They don't put a neon sign on the front door. That's not how it works. And yet, Iran hit it. That level of targeting doesn't come from luck. It doesn't come from guesswork. It comes from real-time intelligence. And that intelligence is coming from Russia and China. Let's slow this down, because once you see this clearly, the entire conflict looks completely different. Start with the basics of what Iran is working with. Ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drones, and now, according to multiple US media reports, hypersonic missiles supplied by China. Now, if you don't know what a hypersonic missile is, here's the simplest way to understand it. Sound travels fast, about 767 miles per hour. A hypersonic missile travels at 5 times that speed or more. We're talking Mach 7, Mach 8, Mach 10. At that velocity, even the most advanced defense systems in the world have an incredibly narrow window to react. These aren't easy to intercept. They're not impossible to stop, but they're among the most dangerous weapons on the planet precisely because of how little time they give you. China reportedly also supplied Iran with anti-ship missiles, weapons designed specifically to sink warships. Combine that with real-time intelligence on where those ships actually are, and you begin to understand the threat level being discussed in classified rooms in Washington right now. Now here's where Russia enters the picture. Russia has one of the most sophisticated satellite and signals intelligence networks in the world. Years of Cold War infrastructure, updated and modernized. When a US carrier group moves through the Persian Gulf, when a British aircraft flies a certain route, when a coalition warship enters a particular corridor, Russia can track it. Russia knows. And according to US intelligence reports, that information is being fed directly to Iran. Think about what that means in practice. Iran doesn't need its own constellation of satellites. Iran doesn't need a $50 billion intelligence apparatus. Iran just needs the phone to ring, metaphorically speaking, with the coordinates already loaded. That is a game changer. That's the story beneath the story. But why? Why would Russia and China take this risk? Why involve themselves in a conflict that could spiral into something far larger? To answer that, you have to zoom out, way out. For years, Iran has operated what analysts call a proxy network. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas in Gaza. Iran funds them, Iran trains them, Iran supplies them with weapons, tactics, and strategic direction. Iran is the senior partner, and these groups are the forward deployed force. Now apply that exact same model one level up. Russia and China are doing to Iran precisely what Iran does to Hezbollah and the Houthis. Iran is their proxy. Iran is their forward-deployed asset in a region that sits at the intersection of global oil supply, shipping lanes, and Western military presence. This isn't conspiracy. This is just geopolitics working exactly the way it always has, through layers, through deniability, through distance. China, in particular, has mastered the art of never being visibly present on the battlefield. You will not see Chinese boots on the ground in Iran, the way North Korean soldiers showed up in Russia to fight alongside Russian forces. Thousands of troops deployed into an active war zone, a fact that barely made a ripple in Western media given everything else happening. China operates differently. China provides the money. China provides the weapons, quietly, through channels designed to blur attribution. China applies diplomatic cover. China purchases the silence of other nations. And then China watches, and waits, and lets others absorb the cost. This is a deliberate strategy refined over decades,
and it is working. Meanwhile, Russia brings something different to the table: operational intelligence, military technology, and institutional knowledge of how to fight the West without directly engaging it. Russia has spent years developing asymmetric capabilities specifically designed to counter American advantages, and right now, that knowledge is flowing toward Tehran. So what is the actual endgame here? On the surface, this looks like a conflict between Iran and a US-Israel coalition. And at the tactical level, that's real. Missiles are genuinely flying in both directions. But at the strategic level, this conflict is being managed by Moscow and Beijing for a very specific set of objectives. They want American military credibility to take damage. Every time a US base gets hit, every time a strike lands close to a sensitive target, every time the evening news shows another explosion in a region where America has promised security, that chips away at the perception of American dominance. And perception in geopolitics is half the battle. They want global energy markets to shift. Iran has already signaled that Chinese ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz will not be targeted. Read that again. Iran has announced a lane of safe passage for China only. While other nations face the threat of missiles, Chinese oil tankers move through freely. That is not a coincidence. That is a negotiated arrangement. That is China securing its energy supply lines while the rest of the world scrambles. They want the financial center of gravity to move east. There are already reports of capital flight from Dubai, money that had been parked there by Indian investors, European businesses, and international funds suddenly moving to Singapore and other Asian financial centers. Dubai built its entire brand on being the stable, neutral ground of the Middle East. Iran just cracked that image, and the beneficiary is not the West. And perhaps most importantly, they want the conversation to shift away from Russia's war in Ukraine. Remember how much attention that conflict was getting? How it dominated every international forum? With the Iran crisis exploding across every channel, Ukraine has practically disappeared from the front page. Ceasefire talks, sanctions reviews, arms supply debates, all of it is on pause in the public consciousness while the world stares at the Persian Gulf. That is not an accident. Here's what makes this moment genuinely historic. The United States is now, right now, today, asking India to resume purchasing Russian oil. The same United States that spent the last 2 years threatening tariffs and consequences for anyone who bought Russian energy is now quietly making calls asking India to please go ahead and buy it, because the disruption in the Gulf has made Russian supply lines suddenly necessary again. Russia's oil revenues, which sanctions were supposed to strangle, have a second wind. Strategically, Moscow just won a round without firing a single missile in the Gulf. Now, most analysts agree that Iran's current government, its military and political leadership structure, is under enormous pressure. The strikes have been severe. The casualties among Iran's command class have been significant. It is not sustainable indefinitely. At some point, the structure collapses or transforms. That may be weeks away or months, but the direction of pressure is clear. But here is the question that Beijing and Moscow are already building their answer to. What comes after? Because when this conflict ends, and all conflicts end, the world that gets rebuilt will reflect whoever planned most carefully for the morning after. And right now, the planning for that post-conflict order is happening not in Washington, but in Beijing and Moscow. The script for what the Middle East looks like after the smoke clears, who controls the energy routes, which alliances get cemented, which currencies get used to settle oil trades. That script is being written in languages that aren't English. This is the deeper truth of what we're watching. Iran is not the protagonist of this story. Iran is a piece on a board, a powerful piece with real capabilities and real losses, but a piece nonetheless. The hands moving it belong to players who are comfortable with patience, comfortable with distance, and very, very comfortable letting others bleed while they advance their positions quietly. The United States is fighting a war in the visible layer. Russia and China are winning a war in the invisible one. And understanding that difference, understanding that the real conflict is not just about missiles in the Persian Gulf, but about who writes the rules of the next chapter of global power, that is what separates the people who truly understand this moment from the ones who are just watching the explosions. Stay with us, because this story is far from over.